The reception hall smelled like lilies and cheap champagne when my husband of 18 years took the microphone from the MC's hand like he owned the whole evening. I remember thinking, Daniel, this isn't your moment. I was wrong about so much that night. He tapped the mic twice, smiled at the crowd of 300 people, and said the words that would end my marriage in front of everyone I loved. Everyone should thank Lauren. She spent 18 years raising my mistress's son. The room went so quiet I could hear the ice melting in someone's glass. And then my son stood up. "Dad!" Ethan said, his voice steady in a way that made my chest ache. "You're finally telling the truth. Let me back up. My name is Lauren Phillips. I'm 46 years old, and for the past 2 decades I've worn the uniform of a United States Army colonel. I've briefed generals. I've made decisions that cost lives or saved them. Soldiers half my age call me ma'am with something close to reverence, and I've earned every bit of it through discipline, through never flinching when the room got hard. But none of that prepared me for the moment my husband smiled at our son's graduation and detonated my life like it was nothing more than a party trick. I want to tell you how we got there because it didn't happen in a single night. It happened over 18 years of small moments I chose not to examine too closely, because examining them would have meant admitting something was wrong with the foundation I'd built my whole adult life on. 18 years ago, I was a captain, fresh off a deployment, dating a charming civilian named Daniel, who worked in commercial real estate and had a way of making every room feel warmer when he walked into it. 6 months into our relationship, he sat me down at his kitchen table, took my hands, and told me something that broke my heart before I'd even met the person it was about. "The baby's mother died during childbirth," he said. "I have a son, he's 3 months old. His name is Ethan, and I don't know how to do this alone." I looked at that photograph he showed me, a tiny wrinkled face wrapped in a hospital blanket, and something in me simply decided. I didn't decide to marry Daniel that day, not exactly. I decided that no child should grow up feeling like an afterthought, like a burden someone else had to explain. I decided somewhere in that kitchen that whatever else happened between me and this man, I was going to make sure that baby knew he was wanted. We married 8 months later. I legally adopted Ethan before his first birthday, and for 18 years I was the one who did the work of being his mother, not because Daniel asked me to, but because I loved him before I understood what loving a child even meant. I was the one who walked the floor with him during colic at 3 in the morning, humming army cadences, because they were the only songs I knew by heart. I was the one who sat in the school nurse's office when he broke his arm falling off the jungle gym in 2nd grade, holding his hand while he cried and telling him colonels don't cry, they get stitched up and get back to work, which made him laugh even through the tears. I was the one who drove 2 hours each way to watch every single one of his junior varsity football games, even the ones where he sat on the bench the entire time, because I wanted him to look up into the stands and see my face there every time without exception. Daniel loved him too in his own way. I want to be fair about that even now, even after everything. He showed up for the big moments, the championship games, the school plays, the moments where there would be an audience to see him being a good father. But the daily grind of raising a person, the unglamorous hours that actually build a childhood, those were mine. I didn't resent it back then. I told myself that's simply how some families divide the labor. I was good at discipline and routine. Daniel was good at showing up for the photographs. There were things that didn't quite add up even in those early years, little inconsistencies I noticed, and then set aside because examining them felt disloyal. Daniel never wanted to talk about Ethan's biological mother. Whenever Ethan as a small boy would ask questions, "What was she like? Do I look like her?" Daniel would change the subject so smoothly, so quickly that it took me years to notice the pattern. He'd redirect to ice cream, to a game on television, to anything except an actual answer. I told myself grief works differently for everyone. I told myself some men can't talk about loss without falling apart, and Daniel simply wasn't built for that kind of vulnerability. I built an entire understanding of my husband's character on that assumption, brick by brick, for 18 years. Ethan grew into a remarkable young man, despite whatever gaps existed in that story. He was thoughtful in a way that surprised his teachers. He was kind to kids who ate lunch alone. And he loved me not in the complicated, obligated way children sometimes love a step-parent, but fiercely openly in a way that occasionally made Daniel's jaw tighten when he thought no one was watching. I didn't understand that tightness back then. I understand it now. The morning of Ethan's college graduation, I ironed my dress uniform with a kind of pride I can't fully describe to people who haven't spent 2 decades building a life around service and sacrifice. I was going to watch my son cross a stage and receive a degree he'd earned through his own relentless work, and I believed with my whole heart that this was going to be one of the best days of my life. I had no idea there was a manila envelope sitting in a drawer at home that I hadn't opened yet, and I had no idea that within a few hours my husband would stand in front of everyone we knew and hand me the worst moment of my life like it was a gift he was proud to give. Looking back now, I realize I spent 18 years collecting small, strange moments and filing them under nothing, simply because the alternative that something was deeply wrong felt unbearable to a woman who prided herself on reading situations correctly. In my career, I've been trained to notice patterns, to spot the thing that doesn't fit before it becomes a crisis. And yet in my own home, I let inconsistency after inconsistency slide past me like weather. The first thing I should have paid attention to was how Daniel handled any conversation about Ethan's biological mother. It wasn't just that he avoided the topic, plenty of grieving people do that. It was the specific way he avoided it. He never once said her name in front of me. Not once in 18 years. When Ethan was young and would ask innocent questions the way children do, what did she look like? Did she like music? Would she have liked me? Daniel would go stiff, almost imperceptibly, and then pivot the conversation somewhere else entirely. A new toy, a trip to the zoo, anything. I used to think it was grief so raw he couldn't access it. Now I understand it was something closer to guilt hiding behind grief's mask, and the two can look remarkably similar if you're not looking for the difference. There were the phone calls, too. Late at night, sometimes past midnight, Daniel's phone would light up on the nightstand, and he'd slip out of bed to take it in the hallway. His voice low, careful, deliberate, in a way that didn't match the casual excuse he'd offer when he came back. "Just a client," he'd say. You know how commercial deals are, everyone wants everything solved at midnight. And because I trusted him, because 18 years of marriage builds a kind of trust that becomes almost structural load-bearing, holding up the whole architecture of your life, I let it go. I told myself that questioning him too much would be its own kind of betrayal. I didn't want to become the suspicious wife who couldn't let her husband have a private conversation without interrogating him. I think about that decision now with a complicated kind of grief. Not just grief for what I didn't know, but grief for the version of myself who trusted so completely that she talked herself out of her own instincts night after night for years. There was a moment at a grocery store when Ethan was maybe 7 years old that has stayed lodged in my memory ever since, sharp and strange, even though at the time I brushed it off within minutes. An older woman in the checkout line beside us kept staring at Ethan, not in the way strangers sometimes admire a well-behaved child, but with a kind of searching intensity, like she was trying to place him. Finally, she leaned toward me and asked quite bluntly, "Is he yours?" I remember laughing a little, saying, "Yes, he's my son," and she opened her mouth to say something else, and then her eyes moved past my shoulder to Daniel, who had just walked up with the cart, and her whole expression closed like a door. She went quiet. Paid for her groceries. Left without another word. I asked Daniel in the car if he knew her. He said no, never seen her before in his life. I believed him because why wouldn't I? But something about the abruptness of her silence sat wrong in my stomach for days afterward. The way a splinter sits wrong under skin, even after you've stopped consciously noticing it's there. Then there was the matter of Ethan's birth certificate and adoption paperwork. Early in our marriage, I'd mentioned almost in passing that I wanted to look through the original documents not out of suspicion, just out of a mother's simple curiosity about the child she was raising. Daniel's reaction was immediate and, in retrospect, wildly disproportionate to the request. "Why dig up old pain?" He said, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "She's gone, Lauren. Let her rest. Let's just focus on our family." I remember feeling almost ashamed of myself for having asked like I'd trespassed on some private grief that wasn't mine to touch. I dropped it. I never asked again. Not once in 17 more years. Meanwhile, Ethan kept growing into himself, becoming someone I was endlessly proud of. He was sharp in school, the kind of sharp that comes from genuine curiosity rather than pressure. He was unfailingly polite to adults, the kind of polite that teachers wrote home about. And he loved me with an openness that sometimes caught me off guard, the way he'd still hug me goodbye before school, even as a teenager, when most boys his age were too self-conscious for that kind of affection in public. I noticed, though I didn't examine it closely at the time, that this closeness between Ethan and me occasionally seemed to bother Daniel. There'd be a flicker across his face when Ethan came to me first with good news, a report card or an acceptance letter, rather than going to his own father. A tightness in his jaw when Ethan called me the smartest person I know at a Thanksgiving dinner in front of extended family. I told myself it was ordinary paternal jealousy, the kind every father probably feels when a mother becomes the emotional center of a household. I didn't consider, not for a moment, that it might be something else entirely, something closer to resentment, or even guilt, curdling quietly under the surface for reasons I couldn't yet imagine. The week before Ethan's graduation, a plain manila envelope arrived at our house, addressed simply to me with no return address I recognized. I set it on the kitchen counter, intending to open it after the ceremony, once the busyness of preparing for guests and family had settled. I had no idea as I placed it beneath a stack of mail that I was setting aside the one piece of paper that would have prepared me for everything that was about to happen on that stage. The graduation ceremony was held outdoors on the university's main quad, beneath a sky so clear and blue, it almost felt staged, like even the weather wanted to be part of the celebration. I sat in the second row of family seating, my back straight out of decades of habit, watching row after row of graduates cross the stage in their black gowns, waiting for the moment my son's name would be called. Daniel sat beside me, and I noticed he'd had more than a few drinks at the small reception beforehand, the kind of pre-ceremony mingling where proud parents sip champagne and congratulate each other on children who've made it this far. I didn't think much of it at the time. Daniel liked being the center of a room. He liked being seen enjoying himself. I'd watched him work a crowd for 18 years and never once thought it was anything more than personality. When Ethan's name was called, I stood up before I even realized I was doing it, clapping so hard my palms stung, watching my son walk across that stage with a poise that made my throat tighten with pride. He found me in the crowd immediately, he always did, and gave me the smallest nod, the kind of private acknowledgement only a mother and son share, a nod that said, "This is for you too." After the ceremony, the university hosted a reception in a large banquet hall for graduating families, the kind of event with a hired MC, a small stage, and a microphone that got passed around for a few brief toasts from faculty and honored guests. I was standing near a round table holding a glass of sparkling cider, chatting with another Army spouse I'd known for years, when I noticed Daniel making his way toward the small stage at the front of the room. I assumed he wanted to say something kind. A father's toast to his graduating son, sentimental, maybe a little clumsy, the sort of thing husbands do at moments like this. I remember actually feeling a small flush of warmth, thinking, good, he's finally going to say something meaningful. He took the microphone from the MC with a loose, easy grin, the kind of grin that comes from too much champagne and too much confidence. The room quieted, expecting a toast. "I just want to say a few words." Daniel began, his voice carrying that particular warmth he always used in front of an audience, about an incredible woman. I felt my chest swell. I actually felt proud standing there, thinking he was finally going to acknowledge in front of everyone everything I'd given these 18 years. "Everyone should thank Lauren," he continued, raising his glass toward me. "She spent 18 years raising my mistress's son." For one full second I thought I had misheard him. I actually looked around the room, waiting for someone to laugh, waiting for this to reveal itself as some strange joke I wasn't understanding correctly. But no one laughed. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight, that presses down on a room like a physical thing. Daniel kept going. He wasn't finished. And the worst part, the part that still makes my hands shake when I think about it, is that he wasn't confessing out of guilt or grief or some drunken need to unburden himself. He was performing. He was smiling the entire time, like a man telling an amusing anecdote at a dinner party, like my life wasn't the punchline. Years ago, before Lauren and I got married, I had an affair," he said, swirling the champagne in his glass like he was savoring a particularly good story. "The woman got pregnant. She left the baby with me and disappeared, didn't want the responsibility. I told Lauren the mother died in childbirth." He laughed, actually laughed, a short, careless sound. "Lauren never suspected a thing. 18 years and she raised that boy like her own, no questions asked." I don't have adequate words for what happened inside me in that moment. It wasn't just humiliation, though. The humiliation was real and total, spreading through my body like ice water. It was the specific surgical cruelty of it, the fact that he was smiling while he did it, the fact that he'd chosen this exact moment, my son's graduation, the culmination of 18 years of work I had poured myself into, as the stage for his confession. I felt every eye in that room swing toward me. I felt the particular sting of pity in the faces of people I'd known for years, the army wives, the neighbors, Daniel's own colleagues, all of them looking at me with the kind of soft, horrified sympathy usually reserved for people who've just received terrible medical news. My hands were shaking so badly I had to set my glass down on the nearest table before I dropped it. Daniel wasn't done. He seemed almost energized by the room's stunned silence, mistaking it for the kind of dramatic hush that precedes applause, rather than the sound of 200 people watching a woman's dignity get stripped away in real time. "She never even asked to see a birth certificate," he added, shaking his head with something that looked almost like admiration for his own deception. 18 years. Can you believe that? I stood frozen, my whole body cold, my mind doing something it almost never does, going completely, utterly blank. I am a woman who has stayed calm under mortar fire. I have made split-second decisions that determined whether soldiers lived or died. And in that ballroom in front of everyone I loved, I could not form a single word. I thought in that moment that this was the worst thing that would happen to me that day. I thought the humiliation had reached its ceiling, that nothing else could possibly happen to make this moment worse or stranger or more unbearable. I was wrong. Because that was the exact moment I saw Ethan rise from his seat near the front of the room, his jaw set, his eyes fixed not on me, but on his father. And he began walking with slow, deliberate steps toward the small stage where Daniel stood still, holding that microphone like a trophy he was proud of. Every eye in that ballroom followed Ethan as he crossed toward the stage, and I remember thinking absurdly that I should stop him, some instinct in me still trying to protect the moment, to keep my son from making a scene that might follow him for the rest of his life. But something in the way he moved told me this wasn't a scene. This was a decision. This was a young man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally set down the weight of pretending he didn't know. He reached the small stage and held out his hand for the microphone. Daniel, still riding the high of his own performance, handed it over with an easy laugh, clearly expecting his son to defend him, to smooth things over, to say something about forgiveness or family loyalty the way sons are supposed to when their fathers stumble in public. I could see it in Daniel's face, that particular confidence of a man who has never once considered that the people around him might see him clearly. Ethan turned first to face the room, and then slowly he turned to face his father directly. "You're finally telling the truth," he said, and his voice was steady in a way that startled me, steady in a way that made it clear this wasn't the voice of a boy blindsided by a secret. This was the voice of someone who had already lived with the truth for a long time, and was only now deciding to let the rest of the world catch up. Daniel's smile faltered for the first time all evening. "Ethan, I know," Ethan said, simply cutting him off, not unkindly but with a finality that silenced the room even further. "I've known for 8 months." I felt the floor tilt beneath me. 8 months. My son had known the truth about his own origins for the better part of a year, and he had never once let it show in the quiet dinners we shared, in the phone calls he made from his dorm room, just to hear my voice in the way he still called me Mom, with the exact same warmth he always had. Ethan explained it plainly, without drama, the way you'd describe a fact you'd long since made peace with. He said that during his junior year, curiosity had gotten the better of him, not doubt about me, never that, but an ordinary human wondering about where he came from. He'd ordered one of those consumer DNA kits almost as a lark, expecting nothing more than a breakdown of ancestry percentages to share with roommates over pizza. Instead, the results had flagged a genetic anomaly that made no biological sense if the story he'd been told his whole life were true. So he did what any sharp, resourceful young man would do. He investigated quietly, methodically, the way I suppose he'd learned to approach problems patiently, without panic-gathering facts before drawing conclusions. He found records. He found a woman's name that had never once been spoken aloud in our house. He even found her eventually alive, remarried, living 3 states away, having built an entirely different life, after walking away from the infant she'd had with a man who was, at the time, still legally married to someone else entirely. "She's not dead," Ethan said, looking directly at Daniel now, and I watched something in my husband's face crumble in a way I had never seen in 18 years of marriage. "She's alive. She left because she didn't want to be a mother, not because she died in some hospital room like you told everyone for 18 years. The room had gone so silent I could hear the air conditioning humming somewhere above us. "I could have told you I knew," Ethan continued, and now his voice softened, though it never wavered. "I thought about it for weeks, but I realized something while I was digging through all of it, going back through old photos, old school records, old memories." He paused, and I watched his eyes find mine across the room. "None of it changed who actually raised me." He turned fully toward me then, and something in his face broke open, not weakness, but a kind of raw honesty I hadn't seen from him since he was a small boy crying over a broken arm in a school nurse's office. "Mom," he said, and the word landed in that ballroom like something sacred. "You raised me, not her, not even him really, not in the way that matters." He gestured almost apologetically toward Daniel. "You were the one who stayed up when I was sick. You were the one who came to every single game, even the ones where I never left the bench. You're the one I call when something good happens because you're the first person I want to tell." I don't remember deciding to cry. I simply became aware at some point during his words that tears were running freely down my face, and I didn't care who saw them. Ethan reached up and unclasped the watch on his wrist, the graduation gift Daniel had given him just that morning, an expensive thing gold-faced engraved with his initials, and he held it out toward his father without ceremony, without cruelty, simply as a fact being stated. "You're my biological father," he said. "I won't pretend that isn't true. But she's the one who became my real parent. And I think after tonight you and I both know which one of those things actually matters." Daniel stood frozen, the watch resting in his open palm, his mouth working soundlessly like a man trying to find an argument that didn't exist. Around the room I could see people who had known Daniel for years, colleagues, neighbors, men he golfed with on Sundays, looking at him now with an expression that had shifted entirely from pity aimed at me to something closer to disgust aimed at him. Daniel set the microphone down on a nearby table without another word. He didn't apologize. He didn't try to explain himself further. He simply turned, pushed through the crowd that had gathered, and walked out of the ballroom doors into the parking lot beyond, leaving behind a silence that felt for the first time all evening like it belonged entirely to me and my son. I stood there in that stunned quiet, my son's hand finding mine the way it had 1,000 times before, and I understood with a clarity that cut through even the humiliation of the last 10 minutes that I had not lost anything that actually mattered that night. I had, if anything, finally learned the full measure of what I'd built. We didn't leave the reception right away. There's a strange etiquette to a moment like that. A room full of people who've just witnessed something they weren't meant to see, all of them suddenly very interested in their napkins, their shoes, anything but the woman standing in the middle of the floor with tears drying on her face. A few close friends came over, quietly squeezed my arm, said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. Eventually, Ethan and I simply gathered our things and walked out into the parking lot ourselves, into air that felt shockingly cool and clean after the heat of that ballroom. We didn't go home. Ethan asked almost shyly if we could just drive somewhere and talk, the two of us, the way we used to when he was younger, and something was bothering him he couldn't quite put into words at the dinner table. I remember thinking that despite being 22 years old, freshly graduated, having just delivered one of the most composed confrontations I'd ever witnessed, he still sounded in that moment like my little boy. We ended up at an all-night diner near the campus, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that's been on the burner too long, the kind of place that doesn't care what kind of night you've just had as long as you tip well. We sat across from each other, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. The waitress brought coffee. Ethan wrapped both hands around his mug like he needed something to hold on to. "I should have told you sooner," he finally said. "About the DNA test, about all of it." I reached across the table and took his hand the same way I had 1,000 times before, after scraped knees after failed exams, after a breakup in 10th grade that had felt at the time like the end of the world. "You told me when you were ready," I said. "That's enough." He shook his head slowly. "I was scared it would hurt you more than the truth already would. I kept thinking if I just figured out how to tell you gently in private, it would be easier than whatever just happened in there." "Your father took that choice away from both of us," I said, and I meant it without bitterness, simply as a statement of fact. "None of this was supposed to come out the way it did tonight. That's on him." Ethan was quiet for a while, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table, and then he began to tell me things I hadn't known, small, specific things that painted a picture I'd somehow never fully allowed myself to see clearly, even after 18 years of living inside it. He told me that Daniel had never once remembered his birthday, without a calendar reminder set weeks in advance, the kind of automated nudge that meant nothing about actual memory or care. He told me Daniel didn't know he was allergic to shellfish until Ethan was 14 and broke out in hives at a family barbecue, and it was me, not Daniel, who recognized the symptoms immediately and knew exactly which medicine to give him. He told me Daniel had never learned the name of a single teacher who'd meant something to him, not one across 13 years of school, while I could still rattle off the names of favorite teachers from 2nd grade through senior year without pausing to think. I used to test him sometimes. Ethan admitted, a small, rueful smile crossing his face. "Not on purpose, not really. I'd just mentioned something, my favorite color, a book I loved, and watch whether he remembered it a week later. He never did. You always did." I felt something in my chest crack open. Not with pain this time, but with a kind of grief for all the years I'd spent quietly measuring myself against some invisible standard, wondering if I was doing enough, if a stepmother's love could ever really compete with whatever mysterious bond blood was supposed to create. I confessed something to Ethan then that I'd never said aloud to anyone, not even to my closest friends in uniform. "I used to be afraid," I told him, my voice lower than I intended, "that someday you'd find out the truth and realize I wasn't really your mother. That I was just filling in, that the moment you knew you'd want the real thing instead." Ethan looked at me like I'd said something almost absurd, his expression softening into something between disbelief and tenderness. "Mom," he said, "I never once wondered who gave birth to me. Not really. Not in any way that mattered. I only ever cared about who stayed. I don't think I've cried like that in years. Not the sharp, sudden tears of the ballroom, but something slower, deeper, the kind of crying that comes from finally setting down a weight you didn't even realize you'd been carrying for 2 decades. Ethan reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and for a while we simply sat there together in that fluorescent-lit diner at nearly midnight, 2 people who had just watched a marriage and a family story collapse in public, quietly rebuilding something sturdier out of the wreckage. Later, when I finally checked my phone, I saw 4 missed calls from Daniel, and a handful of increasingly frantic text messages, each one shorter and more desperate than the last. I didn't respond to any of them that night. I would learn over the following days that I wasn't the only one letting his calls go unanswered. Word travels fast among people who've spent years building a life around appearances, and Daniel was discovering in real time exactly how quickly that world can turn its back on you once the performance stops working. The days that followed the graduation moved with a strange, disorienting speed, the way things sometimes do after a single event reorders everything you thought you understood about your own life. I threw myself into the practical business of separation, almost immediately, not out of coldness, but because after 18 years of military discipline, action has always been my way of surviving what emotion alone cannot carry me through. Ethan stayed with me those first weeks, rather than returning immediately to his apartment near campus, and in the quiet hours between packing boxes and phone calls to lawyers, more of the truth kept surfacing piece by piece like debris rising to the top of water, long after the initial disturbance. It started with something small, a folder Ethan had kept without fully understanding its significance, documents he'd found tucked in an old filing cabinet in Daniel's home office months earlier, back when his suspicions about his parentage had first sent him digging through family records. At the time, he'd been searching for anything related to his birth mother. What he'd found instead, almost by accident, was a set of financial statements that made no sense to a 22-year-old, but made a great deal of sense once I finally sat down and read through them myself. Daniel had been quietly siphoning money for years from an education trust fund I had set up for Ethan back when he was still in elementary school. Money from my own combat pay, and years of careful saving money I'd specifically designated for his college expenses, protected in an account that required both our signatures for any withdrawal. Except several withdrawals over the past 6 years, bore my signature on documents I had never once seen, in a hand that was close enough to fool a casual glance but not close enough to fool someone trained as I had been for years, to notice details that don't quite fit. I brought the documents to a lawyer within days, a sharp, no-nonsense woman recommended by a fellow officer who'd gone through her own difficult divorce years earlier. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters. I didn't go into that lawyer's office wanting revenge. I went in wanting the truth laid out clearly, wanting accountability, wanting the facts of what had actually happened to our family's finances during 18 years of marriage to finally see daylight after being buried for so long. But once an investigation like that begins, it tends to uncover far more than anyone initially expects. The forged signatures on the education trust were only the beginning. There were credit lines opened in my name that I'd never authorized, small enough individually to escape my notice over the years, but substantial when added together. There were debts Daniel had accumulated and hidden gambling losses disguised as business expenses. Loans taken against assets I hadn't even known we owned jointly. I want to be clear that I didn't seek out this financial reckoning to punish Daniel emotionally. I sought it because 18 years of marriage had apparently been built on a foundation far shakier than I'd understood, and a woman who has spent her career making decisions based on verified facts does not simply walk away from evidence like that once she's seen it. The investigation, once formally underway, moved through Daniel's life with the same quiet, relentless thoroughness I'd applied to every difficult assignment in my career. His employer, a mid-sized commercial real estate firm where he'd worked for over a decade, launched its own internal review once certain financial irregularities came to their attention through the discovery process. Colleagues who had once golfed with him on weekends began keeping a careful professional distance. I heard, through mutual acquaintances, that his name had become something people mentioned in hushed, careful tones at industry events. The kind of quiet erasure that happens to men who've built their reputation on charm once that charm finally runs out. His family, too, began to pull away. His own sister, who had attended our wedding 18 years earlier and had always been kind to me, called to apologize for things she said she should have noticed years ago. Small comments Daniel had made over the years that she'd dismissed as nothing, comments that took on entirely new meaning in light of everything that had come out. Perhaps the cruelest turn, though I confess, I felt very little sympathy for him by that point, came when I learned that Ethan's biological mother, the woman Daniel had once described as dead, the woman who had in reality simply walked away from motherhood decades earlier, refused to see or speak with Daniel when he reached out to her, in what I can only assume was some desperate attempt to reconstruct an ally out of the wreckage of his own choices. She had built an entirely separate life in another state, remarried, raised other children, and apparently wanted absolutely nothing to do with the consequences of a decision she'd made 22 years earlier. Even the person Daniel had once used as justification for his deception wanted no part of him now. I watched all of this unfold from a careful distance, focused mostly on Ethan, on helping him process a transition that was, in its own way, just as disorienting for him as it was for me, learning that the father who raised him had built an entire life out of lies, discovering that the mother he'd been told died in childbirth was alive and uninterested. watching the family structure he'd known his entire life dissolve in the span of a single graduation night. Late one evening, nearly 6 weeks after the ceremony, there was a knock at my front door. I looked through the peephole and saw Daniel standing on the porch alone, looking smaller somehow than I remembered him. The confident, room-commanding man who'd once grabbed a microphone with such careless assurance, now standing with his shoulders hunched, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking like a man who had finally run out of rooms willing to let him perform. I stood at the door for a long moment before opening it, not out of hesitation about what to say, but because I wanted to make sure I opened it, as the version of myself I actually wanted to be in this final conversation. Not the wounded woman from the ballroom, not the furious woman who'd spent weeks reviewing forged signatures with a lawyer, but simply myself, steady the way I'd always tried to be for Ethan. When I finally opened the door, Daniel looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in all our years together. Something stripped of performance, something that looked for the first time almost honest. "Lauren," he said, his voice rough. "Can we talk?" Ethan appeared in the hallway behind me before I could answer, having heard the knock, having recognized his father's voice through the door. He didn't look angry. He looked calm, the same steady calm he'd carried onto that stage at his graduation, and he stepped past me to face Daniel directly. Daniel's eyes went to his son, and something in his composure finally broke. "Ethan," he said, his voice cracking in a way that surprised me. "I know I don't deserve this conversation. I know I don't deserve anything from either of you. But you're my son. That never stopped being true, no matter what else I got wrong." I watched Ethan consider this for a moment, not with cruelty, not with the desire to wound his father the way his father had once wounded us in front of 200 people. He considered it the way he considered everything, thoughtfully, honestly, without theater. "Biology made you my father," Ethan finally said, his voice quiet but absolutely clear. "Love made her my mom. Those are two different things, Dad. I think you spent 18 years hoping they were the same thing, and when they turned out not to be, you didn't know how to live with that. But I do. I've made my peace with it." Daniel had no answer for that. I watched something in his face collapse entirely, and for the first time in 18 years of marriage, I felt no urge to comfort him, no reflex to smooth over his pain, the way I had smoothed over so many things during our years together. I simply stood there steady and let the silence hold whatever weight it needed to hold. When I finally spoke, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't reach for cruelty, though I'd certainly earned the right to it after everything. I simply told him the truth the way I would have told a soldier something difficult they needed to hear. "You thanked me in front of everyone we know for raising your mistress's son," I said. "You meant it as an insult. You meant it to humiliate me in the one place I thought I was safest. So let me say it back to you plainly. You're welcome, Daniel. I raised him, and he became a better man than you ever managed to be." Daniel stood on that porch a moment longer, and then without another word, without apology, without argument, he turned and walked back to his car alone. I closed the door quietly behind him, and Ethan and I stood together in the hallway for a long moment, not speaking, simply breathing in the strange, settled quiet of a chapter finally closed. Months passed after that night, and life did what life does. It kept moving forward, reshaping itself around the empty space where an old story used to be. Ethan started his first job that autumn, a position he'd worked hard for through his final year of college, and the company held a small formal induction ceremony for new hires, the kind of modest event with a podium and a handful of proud family members scattered through folding chairs. Ethan asked me to attend, and when the moment came for new employees to say a few words, he surprised me by asking me to stand up beside him at the front of that small room. "I want to introduce someone," he said, his eyes finding mine across the space. "This is the woman who taught me what honor actually means, not through lectures, through 18 years of simply never leaving when it would have been easier to. I don't think I've ever cried so openly in a professional setting in my entire career, and I found standing there that I didn't care who saw it. Because that moment, my son grown successful, standing tall, and choosing publicly to name what our family truly was, meant more to me than any medal I'd ever been given, any promotion I'd ever earned. I think about that graduation night often, the humiliation of it, The way Daniel meant those words as a weapon, and how completely that weapon failed. Because in the end, what he tried to use to destroy me became the very thing that revealed who I actually was, and who my son actually was too. Family was never about the blood we share. It's about who stays, who shows up at 3 a.m, who remembers the small things, who chooses you over and over, especially when choosing you is hard. If this story moved you the way it moved me to live it, I'd love to hear where you're watching from tonight. Leave a comment below and let me know what part of this journey stayed with you the most. We have so many more stories like this one to share with you week after week, so make sure you subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep walking this road together.